Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi, a very special guest tonight on Dev Talks. Someone who talks about China, and I would call him one of the pioneers of China subjects, the realism of China subjects, if I may rephrase myself, on YouTube. It was quite a revelation to me that there is somebody talking realistic things about China when I first discovered the channel of Chris Chappell, who's sitting with me from China and Uncensored. Sir, I'm so honored to have you on my channel as a budding China watcher, as I would call myself. It's indeed an honor to have you on my show.
No, it's great to be here. And I can relate. I mean, China is affecting every country around the world. So sooner or later, we're all going to have to become China watchers.
Oh, indeed. A lot of us in India have started reading about China to realize the certain deception that Chinese actually carry and the certain style of operations, if I may. Nothing is what it seems and nothing they say is real. So that's something that we've realized over the past some time. We've had close relations with China, and I guess somewhere down the line, we've also been given a wake-up call, and I thank China for that. Just to open this conversation, what's up with China right now? Xi Jinping seems to be putting his hand into every little thing, from the global civilization to the security to the whole peace initiative and this and that. He wants to be in Ukraine, Saudi, Iran, and Palestine, and everywhere. What's up with him?
Well, I think what we're seeing today is really the fruition of decades of Communist Party planning. It didn't begin just with Xi Jinping. The Chinese Communist Party has spent decades laying out a system of, establishing itself economically using shady techniques like currency manipulation and intellectual property theft, hacking, to really undermine economies around the world. They've been ingratiating themselves with international institutions like the UN, World Health Organization. We all saw what that got us during the pandemic. So these plans have been underway and in motion for a long time. We're just kind of seeing things come to the surface now because it's becoming much more serious. Definitely, you see the Chinese Communist Party very active, obviously in the Pacific, in the South China Sea, in Pacific Island nations, because their ultimate near-term goal is the conquest of Taiwan. From there, we will see increasing Chinese aggression around the world. Indian soldiers have died fighting China. That's not something any other country can really say recently. India has fought a war with China. So I think there's actually a lot like the United States could learn from India's experience with China.
Thank you for saying that. We normally find ourselves to be sitting alone whenever we are confronted with the Chinese. Of course, we're not scared of that. That is something that our armed forces do plan for. But what we see with Xi Jinping today and the Chinese is that they have decided to go all out within whatever they want to do in terms of their dream of domination of the region and, of course, the larger part of the world. How do you see them kind of opening it out? Was this timing part of the plan? Because a lot of people say that the plan was supposed to start somewhere in 2049. Has he kind of preponed it? Why? What's his motive to do that?
Well, I think 2049 would have been too late. That's the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. I think by 2049, the Chinese Communist Party absolutely wants to control Taiwan. If they don't, that's a big failure for them, big loss of face. I think what is different is that a couple of things happened that kind of forced China's hand. Well, let me go back in time a bit. I'll go back to, I believe it was 2012. This is a pretty good example of how China was kind of left unchecked, or I prefer to say the Chinese Communist Party, since it really is, horrible gangster regime that has taken control of China. And I always want to emphasize that this is about the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people or China as a nation that has existed for thousands of years. So China sent its Coast Guard to the Scarborough Shoal. That's territory in the South China Sea that is claimed by China and the Philippines. The Philippines sent their Coast Guard there. It looked like there was going to be a big confrontation, so the United States stepped in. The United States negotiated an agreement. The guy behind it was a guy named Kirk Campbell, who's still very big in the Biden administration now. So he negotiated an agreement that the Chinese side would leave and the Philippine side would leave, and to avoid a conflict. So the Philippine side did leave. The Chinese side didn't. And there was no repercussions from the United States. China effectively seized control of the Scarborough Shoal and maintains that control to this day. It's able to exclude Filipino fishermen from fishing in shoal, the area that they've depended on for a long time. And I think this actually surprised Beijing, that they could do something so flagrantly aggressive and get no pushback from the United States. In Beijing, it became known as the Scarborough model, where you see like the idea of salami slicing, that they can do these sort of short of war tactics, and the United States, it won't trigger a response. So what we've seen over the past decade is, after the Scarborough Shoal incident, China began building artificial islands in the South China Sea, claiming its territory. They lay claim to the entire region, which is home to about $5 trillion worth of global shipping. If China can control that, then we're all in big trouble. So they began building these artificial islands, and the United States was like, hey, don't do that. And they kept building them. And so, Obama had Xi Jinping to the United States and said, all right, just don't militarize them. And Xi Jinping promised he wouldn't. Today, these islands are fully militarized, and there is effectively no way to change that short of actual military aggression. So really, for many years, I use this as an example. So for many years, the Chinese Communist Party was able to sort of run roughshod over global institutions to do whatever it wanted. I think some real problems came about in 2019 with the Hong Kong protests, where that was just such a global, it was seen by the world. A very clear example of China being this horrible authoritarian regime mowing down the freedoms of Hong Kong. I think that changed a lot of people's opinions about China, the Chinese Communist Party. The genocide of Uyghurs in Xinjiang also changed a lot of people's views about China. And then, of course, the COVID pandemic. That woke up a lot of people to the real nature of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think they're in a situation now where they can't pretend like they're the nice guys or that they just want to do business. Their hand has kind of been shown. And now they don't really need to play nice anymore. The United States came out in the COVID pandemic. The United States is completely dependent on China for medical supplies. That's not something that can be fixed overnight. We saw in the pandemic, there was only one company in the United States that still manufactured masks. Everything else had been shipped overseas to China. So China basically sees that it no longer needs to play the nice guy and can achieve what it wants, what it always wanted, which is essentially domination, world domination.
My question to you with regards to, you brought up the South China Sea with the Scarborough Shoal incident, and which is interesting because currently also we see the Chinese doing something, of the same kind in the South China Sea right now. There's a lot of talk about Philippines. There's a lot of talk about Vietnam. There's a lot of talk about this thing. My question to you is not about the tactical incident there. My question to you is more about, is China trying to pick a fight that is going to win? It's got a fight with Taiwan. It's got a fight with India. It's got a fight with Japan. It's got some issues here and there with the smaller and respectfully smaller Southeast Asian nations. Is China trying to pick its fight? Because this current movement seems a little bit more aggressive than what Chinese used to do before.
I don't think it's been more aggressive with some of the other South China Sea nations. I mean, you have Chinese Coast Guard vessels ramming Filipino fishing boats. There's been plenty of aggression over the years. I think the main thing is it's this salami slicing tactic that they can keep doing these things and there is no pushback, because for a lot of these countries, like, they still depend on China for trade. And I think there's also sort of a signaling being done by Beijing to show that China is the dominant power in the region. And if the United States is not there to help them, then they have no choice but to take whatever the best deal they can get from Beijing. And that will be solidified if China is successfully able to conquer Taiwan. That'll send a message throughout the Pacific that the United States can't defend a democratic country of 23 million people. Do you really think the United States will be there to protect you, Vietnam, or you, the Philippines? It would be the beginning of Chinese control of the Pacific, and then very likely the Indo-Pacific as well.
What I kind of look at with regards to what Xi Jinping is trying to do is basically, the Indian Army has this concept of inching forward, where you have issues, you kind of inch forward and kind of slow and steady move and to whatever end. The Chinese today are in a place where they need to do create one of these issues. It's not going to be able to sustain itself without that. Have they brought themselves to that predicament that they need to militarily or gray zone tactics sort of a attack? They need to do something to one of these countries around them to show their domination, so that the rest back off.
I think they've already been very successful at showing how dominant they can be. A lot of this goes down to just essential lack of resources in China. For example, a lot of the activities in the South China Sea and even off the coast of Africa, around the world, you see aggression by China's maritime militia. It's sort of this. It's not technically part of the military. They're quote unquote civilian, but they essentially act as an arm of China's military to go into regions and kind of assert dominance, take territory, and especially fish. China has completely depleted the waters around its coast of fish. And so you see, I remember I spoke to a Mauritanian activist, that's a country in West Africa. Chinese fishing boats are absolutely devastating the waters around that country to get fish to feed China's enormous population. And unfortunately, the government there has basically given China carte blanche to do it, because what China is often very successful at doing is going into countries where the leader is, has some, anti-democratic leanings, give them money, give them power, and then that gives China a lot of power. So already the Chinese Communist Party has tremendous power around the world. And I think they're seeing just how far they can push it before anyone pushes back. And when you see Chinese warplanes constantly harassing Taiwan, and yet the U.S. hasn't sanctioned a single PLA official that I know of, that sends a very bad message that China can do a lot and not get any resistance. Unfortunately, a lot of the tactics you see in the South China Sea is the same tactics China is using on the border with India. Salami slicing, moving a bit closer, bit by bit, building bases closer and further into Indian territory, as well as making alliances with the countries that surround India, like Bhutan. And yeah, you see just bit by bit they're getting closer and closer and closer. Fortunately, in the case of India, they actually got some pushback, and I think that is very important because if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile.
Yeah, well, you know what? That's what they've been doing since 1952. So that's been we've had a long history of learning from China, I guess. Uh, I want to ask you about Russia. There is, of course, a segment of Chinese thought which tells China to kind of stay away from Russia because of tertiary or secondary sanctions, and that was the narrative till about end of last year. Uh, we see a change. We see a bit more opening of the broader front with Xi Jinping's visit. You know, Xi Jinping and Putin's meeting, if I may. The interesting part I want to ask is, of course, a lot of the West would push up the propaganda to kind of put the Chinese under pressure, and that's fair. I get that. But do you think China is actually wanting to get involved with the Russians, knowing very well that no matter how much they try to dominate Russia, there's still going to be an aspect where the Russians kind of would have some leverage back at China, looking at the fuel, looking at military technology, which is the two core needs of China today. So how do you see this I call it the funniest relationship in the world.
Yeah, the relationship between Russia and China has always been a little fraught, especially back when it was the Soviet Union. But Xi Jinping and Putin's relationship is very interesting. In some ways, I think they might actually like each other. You over the years, you've seen frequent visits between the two of them. Xi going to Russia, Putin going to China. They gave each other friendship medals. I think for Xi Jinping's birthday, Putin gave him a bunch of Russian ice cream he really liked. And in the case of Ukraine, you can see that right before, according to U.S. sources, Xi Jinping had actually asked Putin, they were hosting the Winter Olympics. He had actually asked Putin to delay the invasion of Ukraine until after the Olympics were done. And this is, unfortunately, again, is a situation where there's not a whole lot of pushback to Chinese actions. The West has said, the red line is China cannot sell weapons to Russia. But Chinese companies with links to the state have been selling weapons to Russian companies linked to the state. But that hasn't gotten any kind of real pushback because it's that kind of short of war tactics. Like, do you really want to escalate things because of that? And so we have seen China give tremendous support to Russia. It's been a market for oil and gas. And at no point has China ever condemned Russian aggression. They like to talk about being a peacemaker in this situation because they know that would give China tremendous international power and prestige. But they have not come up with anything that even resembles a plan. They haven't said anything about Russia pulling out of territory. They talk about things like it's important for grain shipments to continue because Ukraine was a major source of grain for China. So yeah, this is just it's actually very similar to the way China leveraged North Korea in the past. North Korea was viewed as a global threat because of its ambition to get nuclear weapons. And China kind of portrayed itself as the only country that could talk to North Korea. And so the rest of the world had to come to China and kind of beg for help. And China was able to leverage that to, how much pressure do you want to put on China if you need China to work with North Korea? That plan didn't kind of got a hiccup when President Trump went directly to North Korea. But I think we see a similar thing with Ukraine, where China wants to be the only country that can talk to Russia, that can talk to Putin. So how much pressure do you really want to put on China if you need China to talk to Russia.
The interesting part about what you've just said, and I must commend you. That's an interesting angle that the Chinese would portray themselves as the only power or the only person who could talk some sense into the Russians and the only power that could talk some sense into the North Koreans. It seems like the Chinese would want to be a part of any big thing that happens in the world today, and you would want, when you make these posters, you want Xi Jinping's poster to be there, pretty much, his photo to be there and everything around. Is that the way that the Chinese would become relevant, but just by being there and saying, I was there, so I'm part of it? Because at the end of it, when it comes down to brass tacks and ground tactics and actually providing the support which is needed of a certain power, then it's missing. How is it going to whitewash this particular factor and we see this in the Indian neighborhood with Sri Lanka and today with Pakistan? Of course, we have no love lost with Pakistan, but at the end of it, if you look at it very, very dispassionately, you do realize that the Pakistanis are 40% in debt to China. So
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, I think the other big factor to the Ukraine situation is China is paying attention to how Russia is able to launch those attacks and how the West responds to it for its long-term goal of taking Taiwan. China would very much like it if the United States did not respond in any way to an invasion of Taiwan.
Yeah.
And that's why the Quad is such a serious threat to the Chinese Communist Party. You have the United States, Australia, India, and Japan working together in a way that I think the Quad was first suggested in the early 2000s, and it never really went anywhere because each country kind of wanted to do business with China. That has changed tremendously. So now you see this union of countries, and that's a major threat to China's ability to invade Taiwan, because if there is this block of the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, that's a big force countering any aggression they would have on Taiwan.
Yeah, that's funny because at the end of it, the Quad is not really a security or a defense alliance, at least not on paper. And the Chinese seem to be worried about it. That's quite interesting because every time the Quad does meet, there are these flying statements coming out of China. Anyhow, the next thing I would want to ask you, the Chinese situation within China is not very perfect as well for Xi Jinping. And correct me if I'm wrong, I look at Xi Jinping today as a lonely leader. He is like, for the lack of a better analogy, he's like Hitler sitting in a bunker, ordering attacks on the Allied forces with forces he didn't have. We see these grand plans coming out of China with I won't say a lack, but a shortage of might to support it with regards to its economy, with regards to its internal stability as well. We've seen a display of a protest won, if I may. The people of China won that protest against COVID. There's no question about it. So there is a certain sense of weakness as well. So when that happens, a dictator, and this is just how I look at it, would kind of seclude himself and keep people around him who are yes men and would tell him what he would want to hear. I see him in that particular aspect. And are they cutting checks that they can't really cash?
Well, there's a couple interesting things about that. So for one, Xi Jinping's position is kind of a result of just the inherent power struggles within a communist system. A lot of what Xi Jinping did in the first several years of his power was what he called an anti-corruption campaign, which was really about targeting and purging a political faction tied to a previous Chinese leader, a guy named Jiang Zemin, who recently died. Jiang Zemin had established an iron grip on Chinese society and politics. And so for Xi Jinping, who was not part of that faction, to survive, he had to purge millions. Officially, it was millions of officials to secure his own position. But I mean, that means at this point, he has to be in charge of everything. He's been called the chairman of everything because he couldn't trust anyone. No one is really going to criticize him to his face anymore because he already has this history of purging people. But that's how it's always been throughout modern Chinese history under the Communist Party. That's how communist systems function. So sort of history has forced him into this position where he doesn't have a way out. But you're right. Internally, China is incredibly weak. They have an economy that is teetering on the brink. The zero COVID policy devastated China's economy. It was already being devastated from a massive real estate crisis. And that's important because in China, local governments aren't allowed to levy taxes, but they still have to pay for a bunch of things. And indeed, local officials are in constant fear of losing their positions if they don't meet central government directives about economic growth and such. And so what you've seen is local governments have artificially propped up GDP and development by burying themselves in debt. I just did an episode today where I think the estimate could be that local debt is up to like $18 trillion. It's like these numbers are insane.
Astronomical.
The Chinese economy is definitely not what it seems on paper. Now, granted, the Chinese Communist Party has been very good at somehow keeping the sinking ship afloat for a long time, largely because of an influx of foreign investment from the United States and other Western companies. That dries up, though. The Chinese economy is in serious trouble. The Chinese Communist Party knows this, which is why they're trying to court foreign investment, while at the same time terrorizing foreign investors by renewing their anti-espionage law, which is leading to arrests and investigations that are very terrifying for foreign businesses in China. And my biggest concern is if the rest of the world does not truly recognize what the threat of the Chinese Communist Party is and works on decoupling from it. If China is successful at keeping global economies dependent upon it, if the Chinese Communist Party is able to conquer Taiwan and make itself sort of the central superpower of the world, that's very dangerous because the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese economy could collapse at any time. And if everyone is dependent upon the Chinese Communist Party system, then when it goes down, it will take everyone with it. So now really is the time when countries around the world need to stand up. Don't allow investment in China. I still cannot understand why foreign investment, like foreign companies, love going into China. India had it right. As soon as they killed Indian soldiers, bans on TikTok, ban on all kinds of Chinese apps. The Indian government understood what those things were, and the United States were still bickering over what to do about TikTok. It boggles my mind.
Of course, a lot of people laughed at it when it did happen, but now over time we realize that there is this thing. And I think about last month we banned another 256 apps of Chinese origin within India. Well, the issue, and you brought out something very interesting with regards to the economy, because India still trades with China, and I'm a hardcore nationalist, so I also question this particular thing. But when I look back and I dig into it and I realize if India needs to grow and face up to China, we need to trade with China, because at the end of it, if I do cut off my trade, my own growth gets hampered. So that's the challenge of, I guess, globalization, and that's again which is interesting to me that this is a Western concept that was brought about and said, okay, globalized world, one village, one family, and that's what India also says, as a matter of fact. But today we see that that particular concept has brought the West, and of course, a lot of us who are confronting China, into a place that we find ourselves vulnerable from just saying, okay, get lost. So
Yeah.
it's kind of backfired. Would you? It's an irony, actually. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. Like all the promises of globalization have fallen apart at this point. In the United States, it was really Bill Clinton who was really pushing this idea that if we just do business with China, don't give them the back of our hand, then it will become a democracy. They'll just see the Western system and all the money, and they'll somehow become a democracy. And yeah, that obviously did not happen. The problem with the idea of globalization is that there are countries that are authoritarian, that are dictatorships, that violate human rights. And the globalization required this switching of ideas, changing the definition of freedom to be the freedom to do business, not freedom of speech, not freedom of belief. And what happened is that instead of making the authoritarian countries more free, it made free countries more authoritarian. We've been forced to adapt to them. And as I said earlier, with the example of COVID and the medical supply chain, the U.S. Being dependent on China for its medical supply chain. Yes, at any single point in time, it's like, oh, it'll cost more money to pull out of China, et cetera, et cetera. But it's kind of a short-sighted view, because China has cost the U.S. so much more. Like those companies, those manufacturing plants could be giving jobs to U.S. citizens. It could be income for the United States. And what will happen is if we dither on this point, then we will be forced to, at some point, very painfully, have to extricate ourselves from China, as in the case with the masks. We could have been moving medical supply chains back to the U.S. gradually and purposefully. Instead, we were forced suddenly to deal with this crisis. And unfortunately, even after all that, I think a lot of those American companies that started making masks have already gone out of business, and everything is still right back in China. So nothing changed.
Yeah, I mean, we faced that interesting challenge in India. As a matter of fact, just before the pandemic, the Chinese bought off all the non-woven fabric from the country. So when we started off, we didn't have anything. But thankfully, our government came into force, and a lot of the people joined in, and we became the second largest manufacturers and actually exporters to the world. The Chinese idiom, or the Chinese plan for the world, is of course targeted to the US. Somewhere down the line, and I've read quite a bit of writings coming out of China since for a while, that the hawks, of course, say that we're ready, let's go, but there are these little moderate voices that come up and are shut out after that, as the Chinese do. But these moderate voices do bring about a sense of realism, and you can see that in their articles in South China Morning Post. You can see that sometimes, I would say, once in a year, once in 6 months, something in China Daily, which you need to read between the lines and say, okay, there's something here. Is that an acceptance by China? Because China is very quiet about accepting its issues. Is that an acceptance by China, that, or a cry for help, or an understanding that, listen, we have gone down this path, there is no way but back, no way but forward, but let people keep on bringing up this moderate nonsense that kind of got the West into our table the last time we tried this? Because the last time it was the moderates that were listened to, and the hawks were considered a fringe element. Today, what we see is the hawks being the mainstream and the moderates being a fringe element. Is this kind of a change of narrative? Because I find it very curious that Chinese state-owned media starts talking about issues that China is facing. It seems like a change of narrative or just planting these little stories around the place. Is this sort of another sort of a information war that they're starting to build up?
Well, I think a lot of the reason you see a shift in narrative is because, according to some of the people I've interviewed on the show, Australian man named Alex Josky, a lot of what Chinese spy agencies would do when interacting with the West or individual companies is they would say this line about we are the moderates of China. We don't want, we just want to do business. But the more aggressive of a stance you take on China, that feeds the hawks back in Beijing. We don't want to give them any fuel, so just please don't, publicly push back against China. And it was this wonderful narrative. You think, oh yeah, you're helping these moderates. You don't want to support those hawks in Beijing. But really, it was just a lie to silence criticism and prevent action until we got to this point where they can be hawkish and there's not a lot we can do.
That's the irony of China, I guess. Coming towards the end, I want to ask you about what's happening within China. How do you see the people of China today living with Xi Jinping?
I think this is a great place to end because this is something that really broke through a lot of Communist Party propaganda, the COVID, the zero COVID lockdown in China. Mm-hmm. At the end of that, we saw massive protests against zero COVID, where people were actually calling for Xi Jinping to step down, for the CCP, Communist Party, to step down. Despite propaganda, that was not something that was really being called for, even in the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. And the effect this had was, it's kind of hard to explain the kind of trauma the Chinese Communist Party has caused to the Chinese people. Turning people against each other, having them report on their parents, having people kill each other, forced sterilizations, forced abortions. There are decades of trauma built up in the Chinese people. But because of the tight control the Chinese Communist Party kept on society, it was always a situation of you might hate the party, but how do you know your neighbor does as well? How do you know that they won't turn on you or turn you in if you say something against the party? Mm-hmm. With the COVID protests, that was really when a lot of Chinese people saw, oh, I'm not alone. Everyone else also feels the same way I do. Unfortunately, after those protests, the party learns its lesson. It didn't send in the tanks to crush the protesters like it did in the Tiananmen Square massacre, because that wouldn't look good. What happened was, quietly after the fact, a lot of those protesters just disappeared. But so you see now that the Chinese people themselves, despite all the Communist Party propaganda, they don't have any love for communism or the party or Xi Jinping. And I think they have tremendous ability to be able to change China.
I'd just ask a follow-up on this, is that the last 2 years have been very interesting in China, especially when the pandemic came in. There was a lot of positivity which was being put across by the Chinese little pigs, if I may. We saw, and I this is in January 2020, before the pandemic was known, but people didn't really know what's happening here. There was this YouTube thing that used to come, which said an infected emergency news nurse. It was a story about this couple with a little child who, had to go through the rigors of COVID, and it was a very heartfelt story. That, of course, later on we kind of got wise and realized that they were trying to, of course, whitewash themselves. What I noticed about this whole thing is that two, three things. One, the people have learned how to protest. They didn't collect in a single place where the tanks could come and shoot at them. They had sporadic protests all over the place. They had these interesting little ways of passing message, airdrops, uh, open, written at the back of toilet seats and this and that and the other. And there was this silent sort of a communication network that came out because a lot of people really knew the white paper thing was all over the place. There obviously was some way that the Chinese people are communicating amongst themselves without, my question, the Great Firewall coming across. 2 years back, we rarely used to see any videos coming out. Today, today the current crisis or the current action that Xi Jinping is taking on agriculture, cutting forests and making rice fields. These videos are on Twitter. They're all over the place. How did that happen?
Well, there's always been some of that leaking out because the internet is a problem for the Chinese Communist Party. Everyone now, like even in very poor rural parts of China, have cell phones. They can post things. But this is a situation like the West really is responsible for building China's Great Firewall and providing them with the surveillance state that they have. It would be great if Google took it upon itself to dismantle the Great Firewall, to say we're going to devote our efforts to breaking through that, getting truthful information into China, getting people's messages out of China. Unfortunately, and you mentioned how protesters were using like airdrop to get information across. Well, what did Apple do? They helped cut off that access.
Cut it off.
Yeah. So this is always a problem. These mega corporations, unfortunately, with tremendous lobbying power, keep choosing a path that ultimately will backfire on them too. So many companies, basically every American company that has gone into China, ultimately gets their intellectual property stolen. Cheap Chinese knockoffs are made of their products, and then that company goes out of business. I do not understand why someone as smart as Elon Musk keeps pushing Tesla in China. You can just open up Chinese state media and see how the Communist Party is making a big push to develop electric vehicles. It's the same exact pattern happening with Tesla, and I cannot understand why Elon Musk still continues to push a China market.
It's quite interesting. Chris, I think you've brought about some very interesting points today because we've had a light-hearted discussion, and I love that because I think a lot of times when we talk about China, a lot of people don't like watching it because people don't really understand the language. They don't understand the Chinese customs, the way Chinese people think, and the way people are in the country. I think we've taken very tertiary issues, and that's something that a common man on the road can relate to. I think both in the United States and India, it's going to be easy to relate to, and I'd like to appreciate that. Of course, it's an honor, as I said at the beginning of the show, to have you on my platform. I look forward to having you more often and actually building up a relation between both the things so that we could learn together and actually learn from you a little more than I could ever provide. But of course, to build up a relation between both the countries who today are faced with a common adversary. At the moment, I won't want to venture out and call it an enemy, but a common adversary, an enemy of the military and an adversary of the country as well as a whole. It's interesting that there are people like you who are talking about China and making it a more approachable subject for a lot of the people who don't know Mandarin. And that's something which is commendable, and I'd like to thank you for that. Thank you so much for coming in here and joining me.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Like I said, look forward to having you a lot more on Dev Talks. Till next time, Jai Hind.